Question is the motion be agreed to. The honourable member for Nelson in reply.
Well, my goodness, Mr President, my goodness indeed. Firstly, let me just say thank you to the member for Hobart for making a contribution on the motion. I appreciate that, and I agree with the remarks made about the difficulty of believing, quite frankly, that we would go to the trouble in this state to be nation-leading in establishing an NPM mechanism under legislation that went through this place, only to, after establishing it, asking it to develop a model, having that model presented and outlined in an excellent report, then utterly fail to fund it. And we're not talking about big bickies here, Mr President. We're talking about an amount of money that actually can just be agreed to over a handshake at a social function and be given to private companies as corporate welfare at the drop of a hat, it seems. We're talking about $1.5 million that was requested for the 24-25 year, $1.7 million for the year following, $300,000 which was given. $300,000. An utter disgrace. But let me now turn, and I'll pick up on that again a little later, let me now turn to the government's, what I can't even bring myself to call as a contribution actually, it's just an insult. I put these motions up, as do all members, in good faith of discussing something appropriate in this place over which we have some parliamentary oversight and responsibility in terms of scrutiny and holding a government to account for the members of our community that elected us to be here to do that job. I believe that the leader, on behalf of the government, began that contribution by trying to suggest that this was an inappropriate motion, that this was not the appropriate place for us to be having this discussion. Utterly astounding for that to even be tried on, Mr President, as a statement here. We are talking about a statutory entity under a piece of legislation that we passed in this place, that we put in place to ensure that as a state we are appropriately undertaking our powers in terms of deprivation of liberty of citizens, an independent oversight mechanism under statute. There is no other place but here to have this conversation and discussion, Mr President. How dare the government suggest otherwise? How dare they? It is not us in this place not doing our job, Mr President, when it comes to protecting human rights. Not while I'm here. It is this government not doing its job to protect the human rights of Tasmanians appropriately when it comes to matters like funding the Tasmanian NPM appropriately. It is this government that is failing utterly. And this place here will not fail in its job of oversight and scrutiny of a government so chronically failing. It's not a good day, Mr President, for this government to make such ridiculous statements. Not only that, apparently this motion, Mr President, apparently is making some sort of demand for arbitrary documents, was the phrasing. Well, excuse me, let's be very clear here. This motion is an entirely reasonable motion, noting a report of a statutory entity, the recommendations that report made, and the call on the government made in this motion, Mr President. An entirely modest and appropriate one is this, just to be very clear. Calls on the Tasmanian government to A, commit to accepting and delivering the report's 8 recommendations in full. Straightforward. We often call for a commitment, an indication of government support of recommendations made by independent statutory entities such as the TNPM. B, deliver an update on any progress made on the implementation of any recommendations since the report's public release on the 1st of December. An update. That literally could have been exactly what the leader did right here in her contribution when she spoke about recommendation 3. She literally provided an update in relation to the recommendation relating to the Commissioner for Children and Young People and the co-location and co-organisation as suggested by the Commission of Inquiry also. She literally did what 3B is calling for in relation to that recommendation. Where's the harm in that? I'm not calling for arbitrary documents, Mr President. I'm calling for information to be shared in the public domain. The leader can do it here at the podium. They could put out a press release. They could put it in a formal response. They can set it to music for all I care, Mr President. Providing an update is a very simple thing to do. And if you haven't made progress, just so we haven't made progress yet. Or perhaps we're intending to do that at a later stage. It's not even asking them to have done it. Just for progress. An update on progress as to what they are doing in relation to it. It's not hard, it's reasonable, it's appropriate for this place to be asking for it, and it's pathetic. It's utterly pathetic that the government can't even see fit to support a motion calling on them to provide an update on their own activity in relation to a statutory entity. Mr President, I can't shake my head enough on this, Mr President. The third thing, 3C in the motion, calls for a detailed called for them to detail a timeframe for the delivery and implementation of remaining recommendations still to be undertaken and completed. Again, it's not calling on them for it to have done it, Mr President. It's not calling for it to be of any particular depth and detail. It simply says, tell us what the plan is, timeframe-wise, for putting the other recommendations into place. It's an update. It's information. It's what we're supposed to seek here in this place on behalf of our communities in relation to government actions being taken or not taken. There's nothing arbitrary about these calls. There's nothing that says it needs to be even in document form. It's simply calling on the government to provide information. And they absolutely show themselves to be utterly insincere in their commitment to human rights and the oversight through the Tasmanian NPM in not even being prepared to provide that. Mr President, it's all very well for the leader to get up here and speak about the government's understanding about how important OPCAT is and how important it is that they have funded thus far the establishment of the TNPM and the work done over the past 2 years, which is detailed in the implementation report that we're noting today. Excellent. That's fantastic. No one's taking any issue with that. Yes, they have done that work and funded that work as required, but here's where the rubber hits the road. We've legislated something into existence. We've funded for it to begin and to develop a model that needs to be taken forward for it to actually do the work as described in the legislation. And now we're just tripping at the first hurdle because it literally cannot do the work. It literally is not funded to do any visits, which is the core function of this role. The Tasmanian NPM will not be able to provide oversight as legislated because it doesn't have the money to do visits. Doesn't have the money. Utterly unacceptable. And for the government to come here and pretend in their contribution that there is anything laudable about the fact that they've failed entirely to fund this entity to do this important work is astonishing. It's all very well for the government to welcome this report and to thank Mr Connick and his team for the report, but if you're going to ignore the report and absolutely prevent it from being implemented through a lack of funding, then there's nothing more than a spitting in the face of Mr Connick and his team. And in fact, just today we had tabled the Ombudsman's annual report, and I'm going to quote from page 15 of that report that was tabled today, and this is what it said in the Ombudsman's annual report on this topic. It says this: on the 1st of December 2023, I published my implementation program report preventing torture and ill treatment in Tasmania and delivered it to the government. This included recommendations for the NPM's organisational design and the development of strategic goals. The report can be accessed at npm.tas.gov.au. And here it is, Mr President. Then says this: regrettably, I have received no response to that report or its recommendations. Now, Mr President, I don't know if the leader inadvertently, perhaps on her part, but maybe not inadvertently on the government's part, stood at this podium and misled this chamber in her response, because she said that the AG had written or had done something in private acknowledging the report to Mr Connick. Yet the Ombudsman's annual report for 23-24, tabled today, says otherwise. So either, although this report was tabled on the 1st of December last year, either the Attorney-General did not respond at all through to 30 June 2024, which is the period covered by the annual report, and has subsequently responded. It'd be interesting to know that timeframe, Mr President. Maybe the leader hasn't misled the chamber. But she better be careful about actually providing us, I think, so that we can be sure we weren't misled, the date at which the Attorney-General communicated with Mr Connick in relation to this report and what form that communication took. Because here in the Ombudsman's annual report, Mr Connick says otherwise, certainly through, I presume, to 30 June this year. Disgraceful. And if it didn't happen until after 30 June this year, if it has happened at some point post 30 June through to now, how pathetic is that? Maybe it was only done because this motion was on the books here in this chamber. Maybe it was only done because they knew they would have to actually speak to it here in this chamber. Oh, but that's right, the government doesn't think this is the right place for us to be discussing this. Well, if it's the only way to get action from the government on this and actually prompt them to respond to Mr Connick, then it's a good thing we're doing it.
Through you, Mr President. I've just seen a letter that was sent on the 5th of June and it does have sensitive information in it, so I cannot table it. I'm sorry, but there was a letter.
I'm not asking for it to be tabled, but it's very interesting if it was...
5th of June.
5th of June is within the time that this Ombudsman's annual report covers, 2023-24. Why would the Ombudsman say, regrettably, I have received no response to that report or its recommendations? So that's an interesting point, Mr President. I think the government's on shaky ground there. Sounds like they're saying Mr Connick is misleading in his annual report.
Not at all.
One of you is telling the truth and somebody isn't. And given that there's a reluctance here on the government's part to be upfront about why they're utterly failing to fund this entity to do its work, it doesn't look good for the government. So, Mr President, as you can tell, I feel quite strongly about this topic. It's because it's fundamentally important. The state as an entity has extraordinary powers over its citizens, and the deprivation of liberty is one of those extraordinary powers the state has. The risks that go alongside that exercise of that power can be so significant and consequential to our citizens, and that is why oversight bodies are so important. We've established the TNPM under statute in this place. We agreed that it was important that we lead the nation to do so. The government invested these past 2 years in an establishment process so that that report, the implementation report, could be developed, a model could be put forward as appropriate for the entity to undertake its work. And here we are at a time the government utterly failing to then fund the entity to do any of that work. Literally not a single visit can occur under the funding provided. So, Mr President, to the motion that I'm asking members to support in this place as entirely reasonable and appropriate is that that calls on the government to commit to accepting and delivering the report's 8 recommendations in full, which are listed there, and any member can read and see are quite reasonable and modest recommendations, some of which the government is already doing, as the leader accidentally gave us an update on as per 3B of the motion during her contribution. 3B calls for a delivery of an update on progress made on the implementation. The government can do that in any number of ways back to this place, any number of ways. It's an easy thing. Tell us what you've done. It's not saying you have to have done it, just tell us what you've done to date. And then 3C, tell us what the plan is going forward to implement them. Such modest, easy asks in this motion, Mr President. So I ask members of this place to support this motion, and I would ask the government to have a little more common decency actually in responding to motions such as this in this place henceforth. It's so unbecoming for a government to get up and suggest that this chamber literally doing its job through motions such as this is inappropriate. I absolutely decry that kind of attitude and behaviour from the government, and ask them to have the self-respect not to do it again. I commend the motion to members and I hope that they will support it.
Question is the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.